Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Duke, and welcome to Freedom Project's lecture series. We've got a really good one this time, the Gospel of John, one of the most austere, spiritually moving, important documents in the history of humanity, I think. It stands alone among the four Gospels in its uniqueness and its emphasis. And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to give you, I think, a really good primer on John, what we can know about John, to expose you to John's beautiful language, and to get us in much closer touch with the gospel that emphasizes more than any other gospel, the God within the man, the Savior inside the human body. And so we begin. We move forward with the Gospel of John, our lecture for today, and we start with this idea that in artistic representation, the gospel writers, down through the centuries, down through the millennia, have been represented, the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have been represented as four various iconic figures. The Gospel of St. Matthew, on the first one there you see is in the shape of a man. The Gospel of Mark is a lion, represented by a lion. The Gospel of Luke by the ox, and the Gospel of John by the eagle. And that, of course, is the distinction drawn between the synoptic gospels, the first three gospels. They are known as synoptic gospels. It's a Greek word that sort of means seeing through something or seeing together. The first three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all have very, very common themes. They share a lot of the same narratives, a lot of the same types of language, and hence they see Jesus in much the same way. These synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, present a relatively unified vision of Christ. And then you get the Gospel of John, which is quite different. And if Matthew is a man because of the emphasis on the humanity of Christ in iconography, Mark is a lion, the voice crying out in the wilderness in that gospel. Luke is represented as an ox because of the sacrificial animal, the ox, the idea of the sacrifice of Christ. And then you get John, which is the eagle. And John as the eagle, the symbol of the eagle, is really important here because in the ancient world, the eagle was considered to be the one bird that could fly directly into the face of the sun, directly towards the bright light of the sun, and not have to blink, to be able to keep its eyes open, to be able to see the sun, to fly directly into its power. And that gave it a powerful image, a powerful symbolism as resurrection and as light, and as that link between this world and the next. And I think that very well signifies what we're going to be talking about in the Gospel of John. Whereas the first three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, look at Jesus in a series of specific ways that are all closely related. They see together the idea of Christ. John sees something different. It's the same Jesus, and there are many of the same stories, but the way John approaches them is really quite sublime and beautiful. And so we move as we begin. What are the origins of John's Gospels? Well, modern biblical scholars do see that John offers a different view of Christ than the Synoptic Gospels. That seems to be universally true, and scholars will date John's Gospel from about 90 to 110 AD, which makes it the latest of the four Gospels chronologically. So it was written conceivably a good 60 to 80 years after the death of Christ, which suggests very probably that it is not the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, who wrote the gospel. That is what we learn in Christian tradition, that down through the centuries, people believed that John, the actual Apostle John, was the one who wrote this gospel. Modern scholarship seems to disagree with that. Scholars now date that gospel to between 1680 years after the death of Christ. And historically, while the gospel was attributed to John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, it is now considered the work of John the Evangelist. That's a name, a composite name. It may be more than one person. When you look at the Gospel of John and the three Johnite epistles in the letters in the New Testament, and the book of Revelation, which was considered to be written by John as well, this is not the John the Apostle. This is what's come to be known as John the Evangelist. Modern scholars use that epithet. It's possible that the author of John's Gospel, the author of the three Johnian epistles, and the author of the book of Revelations were all different people. But we now know them today collectively as John the Evangelist because of the relative similarity between the kinds of language that are used from the Gospel through the letters to the book of Revelation. And so now it is considered the work of John the Evangelist, 3 epistles, Revelations, and the Gospel. And John seems to have originated from Jewish origins. This is an interesting historical point, too, and it's certainly, all of this, by the way, is debatable. I mean, the thing that's so wonderful about the Gospels is they maintain their sense of mystery. We can't get a completely scientific, empirical understanding of who, what, when, where, how, and even to some degree why. We don't have the documents, we don't have enough of the primary evidence from the period to be able to make a very coherent, completely coherent understanding of these Gospels. So all of this is highly speculative. It reflects what modern biblical scholarship knows, and there are reasons, by the way, to be suspicious of modern biblical scholarship as practiced by archaeologists, as practiced by literary interpreters and theologians, because our fundamental premises in this century have changed a lot since John's day, and it's inevitable that we will, as every generation does, bring our own prejudices to bear on the evidence that we have. But the current scholarship seems to suggest that John originated this Johnine community, this John the Evangelist worldview, seems to have originated from Jewish origins. And if you read the Gospel of John, as we will together, you will see that John is very much writing a book from a Jewish perspective. He is both attacking the short-sightedness of the Jews, and when John uses the word Jews, he doesn't necessarily mean this to be specifically racial. It becomes very cultural because John himself identifies as Jewish, and the group of Jewish Christian individuals, as the two religions were starting to pull farther apart at this time in history, John is writing to what seems to be a group of Jewish people who had come to embrace Christian theology and Christian doctrine, and were in the process of sundering themselves further from their initial Jewish ties. And so we have kind of an interesting gospel. John, who identifies as Jewish, the people he's writing to and for, seems to be identifying them as Jews as well. And yet in the Gospel of John, more than the other three Gospels, Jesus is very harsh on his Jewish brothers and sisters. He's very harsh on the Jews of Jerusalem and Galilee and all throughout that part of the world. And the only way to make sense of it, and many scholars point this out, that a careful reading of the Gospel of John shows us that John's attack on Judaism, if we can call it that, attack on certain Jews in the Gospel of John, is really cultural. It's not necessarily racial. And so what he's basically suggesting is those Jews who, for whatever reason, are blocking or impeding or seeking to supersede the message that Jesus brings. And when we see this gospel being written, finally codified and written down, we know there were earlier variants of it as well, but from the period between 90 and 110 AD, again, a good 60 to 80 years after Christ died, that distance there between the gospel as we have it and the primary life of Christ makes us realize that the odds of this being the Apostle John are almost negligible. But the way that Jesus goes about his business in this gospel is quite remarkable. So he is a Jewish individual who is moving among Jews and criticizing harshly Jewish unwillingness, certain ethnic unwillingness on the part of some Jews to see, hear, recognize, and embrace his message. And so we see from our chart there that John seems to originate from Jewish origins and perhaps could have been written in response to a furthering divide between a church and synagogue, a furthering debate between Jewish people, people who identified as Christians, and those people in the middle who were moving away from their Jewish religious faith towards Christianity. And so when you see it in that context, much of what Jesus is saying will make greater sense. And in terms of the influences of the Gospel of John, now there are many things that influence John's Gospel, including there's a long time that scholars didn't believe that John, or the writer of John's Gospel, for a long time we believed that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were unknown to John, that it was probable that Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels, which were written earlier, might not have been understood or known by the author of John's Gospel. And now we're beginning to push back at that as well. Scholarship is tending to move the other way and suggesting that, yes, indeed, John, the evangelist, would have had, or his group would have had access perhaps to those Gospels. So it shows you the vagaries of biblical scholarship after all these millennia. However, we can definitely trace some important influences, and one of them is this very interesting figure, and there's his picture, Philo. Philo of Alexandria, a philosopher, he was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, which is a remarkable thing to be. Notice that he was born 20 years before the birth of Christ, and he died 50 AD, about 20 years after the death of Christ. So his life nicely bookends the life of Jesus. And we know that he was a Jewish Hellenistic philosopher. In other words, he was ethnically, racially Jewish. He was a philosopher, but he was also Hellenistic. He lived and worked in Alexandria in Egypt, and he had very much become, as a Jew, he had very much become part of the larger Hellenic Jewish world. So the Greek influences, the classic influences. You may recall that St. Paul himself was both a citizen of Rome and an Orthodox Jew. And so consequently, Paul had a unique perspective to bring to bear. The gospel writer Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke, was also a Hellenistic Jew, or Greek in his origins and his ideas. And so we see by the time the Roman Empire had conquered Judea and brought the Jewish people under the sway of the Roman Empire, you have much of this. You have this wonderful cultural crossroads that took place in the Middle East. All of those wonderfully Hellenic, Greek, Hellenic, Roman ideas, all of the rationalism, all of the Roman philosophy, the mythology, was now being discussed. The language, the great books of the classical world were much more available in the Judaic world. And similarly, Judaism and the long history of Judaism, going back thousands of years before the birth of Christ, also had begun to impact Greek-speaking people in the area as well. So you have this wonderful cross-pollination between the Jewish and the Hellenic cultures. So Philo of Alexandria, whose life bookends Jesus's, who did not live in Jerusalem, nevertheless was philosophizing in Egypt and Alexandria, the great library there, he employed an interesting methodology of allegorical interpretation, to reconcile the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, with Greek philosophy. You may recall that this reconciliation would occur a couple of times for Christians. St. Augustine in the 4th century did a good job. Augustine was a pagan Greek philosopher born in Africa who was also a professor. And when he converted to Christianity, he methodically went about aligning Platonic thought, the thought of Plato, and demonstrating how Platonic thinking, Hellenic Platonic thinking, and biblical New Testament thinking could be reconciled. It was a wonderful thing. And we know 1,000 years later, Thomas Aquinas did a similar thing. Thomas Aquinas actually reconciled the thinking of Aristotle, the much more complicated Hellenic philosopher, at least in regards to Christian philosophy, the great scientist Aristotle. And what Aquinas would do in the Middle Ages would be to reconcile Aristotelian thought with Christianity, which allowed Christianity to continue to evolve and become bigger and more intellectually gripping. But before all that happened, and before there was really a New Testament to speak of, Philo of Alexandria was doing a really important thing. He was working hard to reconcile the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, to reconcile that with Greek philosophy and Greek thinking. He was mildly successful. It didn't catch on much in the Jewish community. Philo's reputation, Philo's influence among Jewish scholars is minimal. It's not particularly overwhelming. However, he did create and tie some concepts together that were going to be really important for the Gospel of John. For the ancient Greeks, the Hellenes, the idea of logos is a Greek word. It means literally word. The idea of logos for the ancient Greeks, it signified cosmic reason, the logic, the order that signified God itself, the logical way we could read and the rational way we could understand the cosmos as an animated place that was created by God, that was infused to some degree with the Spirit of God. That's for the Greeks how they viewed it. That makes a lot of sense when we consider the opening of the Gospel of John, which we will do in a moment. So for the ancient Greeks, logos, the word, it signified this cosmic reason, this almost animistic sense that the universe as created by God was a rational place that could be understood, that unfolded scientifically, rationally, we would say, and that reflected the mind of God. Philo merged the Greek concept of logos and the very similar Hebrew idea that we see in the Old Testament of wisdom. Think about the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Think about books like Ecclesiastes. Think about the wisdom texts of the Old Testament and the emphasis on this kind of knowledge. When you think about wisdom, wisdom is not in the Old Testament. It is not human sagacity or wiseness of human beings. It really is a subordinate idea of fear of the Lord. The dominant virtue in the Old Testament, if we read it from beginning to end, the dominant virtue of the Old Testament is this thing called fear of the Lord. To be a righteous person was not necessarily to be powerful or rich or pious. It was not necessarily to have a lot of earthly knowledge. Fear of the Lord, that wonderful virtue of the Old Testament, means simply not fear as in fear and trembling, not fear as in the idea that God is something abusive or terrifying that makes it impossible for us to relate to him. No, when they said fear of the Lord, when the ancients, the Hebrews, meant fear of the Lord, what they meant was the subordination of one's will to his. Are you fearful of the Lord in the sense that you go about your daily life, your daily decision-making process, consulting him first? Does he have the highest place in your life? Is he at the front of your mind in every profane act that you do, every secular act that you engage in, and certainly when you try to pray and invest yourself in the ideology of the religion? Do you keep God as the primary entity? That's fear of the Lord. It's really a beautiful concept. When I explain it to my students, we think about satellites in the sky. And we think about how so much of our technology, so much of our lives are geared to these satellites. You want to get someplace in your car, you want to access the internet. Our technology, our devices link up to these satellites in the sky, and without them we would have nothing. We orient everything according to these satellites orbiting around the earth. If you think about it metaphysically, fear of the Lord is the same thing. In all that you do you orient yourself first and foremost to the Lord? Do you fear him? Do you revere him? Do you centralize him? Is he your satellite, so to speak, by which you conduct and guide your life on this earth? And so what Philo did, that we're going to see at the opening of the Gospel of John too, is Philo took that Greek word logos, again, the Hellenic and the Judaic. He takes this Greek word logos, the word, which meant cosmic reason, or the order, the divinely appointed order of the universe at God's hands. And he's going to combine that with the wisdom literature, the idea of wisdom in the Old Testament, this idea of the fear of the Lord. And you get this wonderful account that the writer of the Gospel of John perhaps didn't know directly from Philo, but certainly does very similar things. And so if we take a quick look before we move to the Gospel itself, an artistic representation of John the Evangelist by François-André Vincent, and this would have been the late 18th, early 19th century, and we see the artist representation of what the evangelist might have looked like in his robes, eyes cast firmly towards heaven, looking at the sun, right? Something that only the eagle could do, and the eagle by his side looking at him, the symbol of John, a wonderful way to separate John and his iconic symbol going back thousands of years, the eagle, and yet incorporate them as one. Even they become two separate entities here. John is not the eagle, but he is performing the task of the eagle, looking towards the heavens, and his gospel is going to be predicated on that, right? Taking the heavenly aspects of Jesus Christ in his human form and making them manifest in his gospel to those who read and hear the word. So it's a beautiful image, and you can see the light of the sun illuminates his face and the entire right side of his body, our left side looking at him, while the eagle is himself somewhat shadowed. So a really neat play on all of that. As we move to the Gospel of John, the prologue, arguably one of the most recognizable, if not the most recognizable, opening to any major work in Western culture or in world culture is the Gospel of John. This opening is absolutely epic. It is cosmological. It is mythopoetic. One of the things I love about the Gospel of John, the other Gospels don't do this. The Gospel of John does it. It begins not with heaven or earth, It begins with the prehistoric myth-making, right? It begins with the primordial, prehistorical aspects of who Christ was. And how does, it's a great paradox for the human mind to try to get its mind around. How in the world could the eternal God, the omniscient God, the God who is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-seeing, the great I am from the Old Testament. One of the key phrases of Jesus in the Gospel of John is I am, the famous 7 I am statements that we will see next week when we're together again. I am. And it's not a coincidence, it's not an accident, it's a design, right? 7 days of creation, including the Sabbath, 7 I am statements. And as God revealed himself to the ancient Hebrews through Moses, I am. My name, God said, is being itself. Without my name, there can be nothing. I am my name. Beautiful spiritual, metaphysical understanding of being and essence. And John's gospel is gorgeous in the way it sets the stage for the coming of the human Christ by taking one step back. J.R.R. Tolkien did this in his Lord of the Rings. When Tolkien, he called it subcreation. We as human beings, as we are created in the image of God, one of the major tasks we have to honor God and to fulfill our own destinies is what Tolkien would call subcreation. He is the creator. He is I am. Our job is in our own lives to create things, to create children, to create wealth, to create families, to create happiness, pieces, communities, civilization. The beauty of it, and Tolkien called it subcreation. The mark of the created is to engage in acts of subcreation in honor and in honor of God, but also as our way of fulfilling our role as his creatures. And in The Lord of the Rings, you may recall that what Tolkien does is he creates a whole mythopoetic universe. Before you get to the creatures in Middle-earth, the human, the elf, the dwarf, and the interactions of people, the day-to-day politics and wars and battles and struggles, Tolkien gives you this shocking mythology, cosmic mythology, out of which those characters and those races of creatures make sense. John does something really remarkably similar. He's going to give us the pre-theology. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's a remarkable opening. In the beginning. Note the first 3 words of the Gospel of John take us right back to the book of Genesis. In the beginning, the very opening of the Bible is those words. And if you translate those words into Greek, in the beginning, you get the word loosely, Genesis. The book of Genesis, the origins and the mythopoetic, and I don't use myth to mean false, by the way. I'm using myth in the sense that the mythic is the language we use to talk about those things that are beyond us. What is the language? When we talk about heaven, hell, God, angels, demons, when we talk about a world beyond our material understanding, a world beyond our senses, a world that can't be empirically verified by our science, a world that is beyond and transcendent, many of the ancients recognized, and certainly people like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis did too, that the language that we use to talk about those very real things is the language of mythology. And what I love about this is that the book of Genesis opens the mythic creation of the universe, the prehistoric creation of the universe, the pre-human creation of the universe. That book, Genesis, in the beginning, is brought back. The same God, the same Word that created heaven and earth is now present at Christ's entrance into the world. It makes perfect sense. What did God do in the book of Genesis? He entered the void, and he created through his Word. God said, let there be light. God said. All right, so you have the Father God and the Word, the literal Word, the Logos that he speaks, becomes a mediating agent between him and the Spirit of God. We learn that there is God the Father and the Spirit of God, you may recall in the beginning, in the book of Genesis. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters. So right from the get-go, you have this image of the Creator God, and you have the Spirit of God that hovers over the waters. And what is the go-between between those two entities? It's the Word. God speaks, And presumably, the Spirit acts. The Word calls into being. All three are absolutely distinct, but all three are absolutely necessary. And the implication that John seems to be making here is that that Word that God spoke between his Father, his fatherly self, and his Spirit was the Son. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you see how absolutely beautiful that is. It's for whatever else you want to say, it can be perceived as alarmingly Trinitarian too, can't it? This idea that there was the Word was God, the Word was with God, God. So in other words, to be with God draws separation. To be God, right? To be God means sameness. And so you're getting this working through of an idea that was going to become so important down to this very day. In the beginning was the Word. You have a new Genesis here, don't you? Because the world's being made anew. The world that Christ mediated, the world that the Son of God, the Word of God mediated, that world is in a way being reborn, born again. The Word who brought light through the power of the Spirit and through the mind of God, the Word that brought creation in heaven, the sun, the moon, and human beings, that Word now is going to enter creation. It's going to take bodily form, and it's going to enter the human realm. It's a remarkable, remarkable image. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. This same Word that is entering humanity. We call it, right, the hypostatic union. That fancy way of saying that union of divine Spirit of God and human flesh, earthly human flesh. That hypostatic union. That same was in the beginning. All things were made by the Word, by Him. And without Him was not anything made that was made. Again, the power. The Word is God. The Word works with God. The Word is a mediator between the Spirit of God and the Father God. And it's a remarkable, you see what's happening here is beautiful. This is the 7 days. This is the creation. This is the void being separated. This is the Spirit of God descending upon the waters. And ex nihilo, out of nothing, comes something. Only this time, He's not creating the world. He's changing it. He's rebirthing it. The Word that made that world is going to take human, material, earthly form, and it's going to enter that world. It's a radical there's nothing like it in the history of the world. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and life was the light of men. The very first thing that the Word spoke was light. The very first thing called to being. Before there was a sun, before there was a moon or stars, before there could be any other source of light in the void, was the light of God. That was the light, and He is that light. It's a remarkable thing, too. If you think about the candle, think about a candle for a moment, and then if that candle is God, then the flame and then the light from the flame are also separate entities, right? So you've got the candle, you've got the flame, and then when you look at that flame, right, depending upon how far you carry it out, the light shines. That's also another nice Trinitarian argument, nice Trinitarian metaphor for the closeness, the sameness of these things, and yet their distinctness. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life. All things that live were mediated by that Word. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. And that's a beautiful account of our tragedy, doesn't it? After the Word had brought, with the aid of the Spirit and the mind of God, had brought into being all things, including us as human beings, the darkness, where'd the darkness come from? The darkness came from our abuse of choice. Right? We were given choice in the garden. And what God? God would have to do this. If God made us, what benefit could God have accrued from our forced worship? If we were mindless creatures who could only choose to worship and obey and follow, what genuine joy or what genuine satisfaction could God derive? It would be as if you and I were to go about making little robotic mini-me's, and we program those little robotic mini-me's to follow us around town every day, saying how wonderful we were, how charming we were. After a while, unless you're a complete egomaniac, that would wear pretty thin. It doesn't mean anything. And in the Garden of Eden, in that perfect place of light, we chose not God. And much to his own detriment, God knew that he had to make us free to choose something that wasn't him, or the whole system was a scam. And we did choose not him, and that brought darkness into the world. And here you have the restoration of the light. After all of these thousands of human years that passed before the coming of Christ, civilizations rose and fall. But they were dark places, because ultimately the word had not healed what had been broken. The light had not come to shine again in the darkness that was imposed by our own choice. And in the gospel, the 5th line of the Gospel of John, it tells us, this light of God, this word, it shines in the dark. The dark cannot efface it. But the darkness did not recognize it. When the light of the word entered into human understanding, entered into tangible physical reality, entered into our world in the body of Christ. When that happened, the dark world did not recognize the light. I mean, it's a remarkably tragic thing, not just for us, our darkness and our sinful inability to see, but it's tragic for God too, because the God who created the universe is not recognized by his own creation anymore. When that word is made flesh and enters the universe comprehends him not. First 5 statements in the Gospel of John are, again, epic is the only word for it. This is primary creation being repeated. This is the primary act of interaction between Father, Son, and Spirit in the creation of the universe. This is a teaming up again to take back, to reinstate, to give new life and new birth to those who have taken that original plan and warped it. And it's a beautiful image. We go on a little bit further in that introduction. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. Beautiful, right? And you think about it, I understand about John's gospel, what is so unique about it, like Mark's gospel, there is no nativity scene. There is no nativity scene, no stories of Christ's childhood, no wise men or magi. John's gospel, now remember who it's being written for. If modern scholarship and the accreted scholarship of 2,000 years is right, then it's quite possible that this was being written for a community, this gospel, that was beginning to pull apart. A major gap is being opened between the Jewish roots of these followers of Christ and the call of the new religion. And it was becoming divisive. The two, Judaism and Christianity, are beginning to really branch. The origins move far, far apart from each other at this point. And what is interesting here is that for this audience of obviously educated Jewish people who, in many instances, had been moving towards Christ, who had become to embrace the idea that Christ was the Messiah that was promised in the Old Testament. Given all of that here, the primary mystery, the primary miracle of the Incarnation, perhaps doesn't need to be rehashed. And if John's emphasis here is to sort of scale back empirical reality, material reality, to give us a glimpse of who this Christ is in that world, that prehistoric world, that pre-creation world, then the image of Christ as a little child isn't as necessary for the story. He begins with John the Baptist, which is really a remarkable choice, because John's purpose here is not even necessarily to baptize Christ. It is to call dramatic attention to the degree to which John himself is not the Christ. He is not that light. There was a man that was sent from God. His name was John. And the same came for a witness, his entire premise. I mean, that's a pretty remarkable thing. If you think about the birth of Jesus through the Virgin Mother of God, you think about that for a moment, and what a remarkable, remarkable statement of love and faith that was, to single out of all human women, that woman, to bear the vessel, to be the vessel through which the eternal Word, the Logos, is enfleshed. It's a remarkable gift. And a similar gift was bestowed upon this man, John. He is picked out. He has his own ministry. He has his own career, let us say. He has his own thoughts, feelings, and faith perspectives. And yet, primarily, the Gospel of John reminds us that John the Baptist was picked for no other reason by God but to bear witness. It's a remarkable thing, to bear the Son of God and then to bear witness of him. The remarkable blessings that devolve upon Mary and upon the Baptist. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light. In a dark world, John sees it. In this dark world, John is the one who first points out that light to the confused, the suffering, the poverty-stricken, the sick, the authoritarian, the busy rich man who pays no attention, the Pharisee who thinks that the mystery of God, the mystery of the Messiah, is a sealed book. John comes in all of his humility to point, to witness. Milton has a famous line, the great English poet, "They also serve who only stand and wait." And to some degree, I always think of John when I think of that, John the Baptist. They also serve who simply witness. His greatest miracle, John, is to remind everybody not who he is, but who Christ is. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that comes to the world. Every one of us, when we come, when our bodies are ensouled, when the moment of conception, when soul and body, when form and matter interact with each other, that moment, and this too has its analogs in Hellenic culture in some ways. If you go back to the Greek philosophers, the argument is that it took form and matter to make life, human life, or even animal life, plant life. That two things have to happen: matter, material, raw material. That's the stuff of nature, right? Flesh, blood, bone, sinew, right? This is what the mother provides. The argument was in conception. She provides the material out of which the human being will physically appear and grow. And then the male would provide the seed, or in this case, the soul, would provide the soul. Matter, form. When those two things came together, random matter is given shape and form. Right? And Aristotle wisely pointed out, note what happens when a living human body dies. Within short time, when the soul leaves the body, in a very short time, the body decomposes till it is no longer recognizably human. When the soul is in the body, we have human form and function. When the soul leaves the body to go to its eternal reward, the body falls to pieces. It reverts back to matter, without soul to animate it. Remember, man, that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And so this is the argument, form and matter of this. John is the light. There was a man sent from God, and John is that. John points to that light, the light that lights every man that comes into the world. That part of us that is divine, that part of us that lives forever, the immortal part of us, the light in us is our souls. And it must come into the body, into matter, the same way Christ entered the material universe, in the form of this human birth. So you're seeing so much of, and we're 9 lines into the opening of John, and there's so much philosophy, there's so much cross-cultural ideas being shared back and forth between the Greek philosophical and the Hebrew. So much of this is a wonderful, wonderful accounting, divine accounting. It's a book of Genesis again. It's the Genesis of the New Testament. And we learn moving forward. He was in the world, this Word that was light. that both was God and was with God. He was in the world, and the world knew him not. The world was made by him. Two remarkable statements. I started with the second one first. He was in the world, and the world knew him not. We talked about that. But we want to stress the Genesis origins of this. The world knew him not, but the world was made by him. Father, Son, and Spirit, the one, the unified God. And it's interesting that in this moment, this incarnation, this moment when the Word enters the world, it is remarkable. The unity, the inseparability of Father, Son, and Spirit in a transcendent context, for the sake of our benefit, is temporarily sundered, isn't it? That the Son becomes a man. And in the Gospel of John, the Son of God who becomes man is constantly referring his audiences back to the Father. That bond between Father and Son in this Gospel is staggering. It's as if for this brief 33-year period in human history, the only time in human history, we think about the consequences of the incarnation, the embodiment of the Son of God as man. We think about that almost exclusively from the perspective of the human. What does it mean to us as human beings? The great news. That's why they call them Gospels. This is the good news, right? That God became man to save us. That's our human take on it. But think about what it must have meant, if we can allow ourselves to imagine for a moment, what it meant to God, what it meant to the Father and the Spirit. This perhaps, in a way, they're still linked, they are still one being, but in that material form that the Son of God takes now, there is a separation, a palpable separation, a palpable teleological difference now between Jesus Christ, the Son of God in human form, and between the Spirit and between the Father. So what for us is a blessed event, what for us is salvation, is in a way a sundering. It is in a way a separation. It is in a way a period of suffering, one would think. Human reality, when divinity takes on it, human mortality, and all of its limitations and all of its weaknesses, its hungers, its needs for sleep and food, its ability to feel pain, to suffer, to become dejected, when the divine takes on itself this blanket of humanity with all of its rips and tears, there is a sundering. And what for us becomes a joyous event is sacrificial. From the moment Christ becomes man, becomes human, he is already engaged on the sacrificial path that will eventually lead to his bloody crucifixion, where he ends up giving all that body and all that blood back. But it's a 33-year process of suffering as a human being. Doesn't mean he's not joyful, doesn't mean he's not mindful, doesn't mean he doesn't benefit from the aspects of humanity. But it's a different thing, isn't it? A remarkable thing to try to consider it. And if we read the Bible, I tell my students when I teach them the Bible at the university all the time, the story of the Bible is God's story. Just like when we read Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? We're going to take Hamlet, the perspective of Hamlet, as our primary issue. And I think when kids are taught the Bible nowadays, it's almost always taught from the perspective of us, or the perspective of Moses or David or Samson or Delilah. What does it mean? What is God's presence, God's love, God's anger? What does it mean to this person, that person? But the only really way to understand, I think, the Bible first, it's great. Those are satellite problems, right? Yes, by understanding God, we can understand the mind of Moses, the fear of Moses. We can understand the pride of Solomon. We can understand the desperation of David and his sin. We can understand those things. And those are absolutely life-changing truths for us. But it won't work, I tell my students, it will not work unless you recognize that it's God's book. It's not man's book. This is God's attempt to manifest and make us realize in a mediated way, not being able to not being able to get the divine, the all-powerful, the all-knowing between these two temples. This little brain that we have is not big enough to comprehend those eternal absolute mysteries. What God is doing in the Bible is giving us a way through mediation and accommodation to understand things about him. Not everything, can't do that, could never understand all that he is. And when you think about that, this idea of the Bible as a whole really being a God-centric book, and it sounds obvious to think about it, but how many of us actually read Scripture or think about Scripture in our daily life from that perspective, from looking at our world from his world, by trying to allow, he's given us the tools to do it, language, the Word, right? What is the Bible? The Bible is the Word of God. And so what did he give us to try to understand this mediated reality in our fallen, frail nature? How can we make sense of, how can we process, how can we come to understand what he's trying to tell us about himself and about his world, his understanding? When you see it that way, I think it's a whole different way of seeing. And this idea of the opening of the Gospel of John becomes really, really palpably powerful. He was in the world, and that means he was separated from the world he was in. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. So he left his own. He left the Father and the Son, at least to the degree that that physical body was separated and bound by the laws of material reality. He left the Father and the Son and came to those he created in body, and they knew him not. This is a God without a country. This is a God between two worlds, one he can't return to until his ministry is finished, his mission is accomplished. The other that he created that can scarce acknowledge him. But as many as did receive him, as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. Now that is remarkable. We know what it means to be saved. But look at the language here. We get to become, because of Christ's sacrifice, what he became to us. Because of his sacrifice, in this human realm, we can become the light. We can become the Word. And we can become the truth. That does not mean, and please don't misunderstand me, no deistic heresy here. We don't get to be God. We don't become Jesus Christ. But we can become, in our worlds, what he became for us. We can be lights and beacons. We can be purveyors of the word. We can be proselytizers of the faith. We can seek the redemption and the salvation of others because of what he did. It's a remarkable gift, seen from his perspective, to the degree that our limited human understandings are capable. But as to those of us who receive him, to us he gives the power to become sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. And the price of admission is really quite low. Do you believe I can do this thing? Do you believe I am who I say I am? Even to them that believe on his name. And who are they? They are those which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. So what happens, right? Those that have this power, those that become sons of God by calling on the name of the Lord, they are born not of blood, not of biological blood, nor of the will of the flesh. That's sexual intercourse in a way. Not the blood. The ancients, both Hebrew and Greek, believed that the unborn baby was composed out of the blood itself. So, to be born in this way is not to be born the way man is born. Not born of blood, not born of the will of sexual intercourse, not that, nor even of the will of man, but of God. And the Word, and this is the absolute glorious crowning consummation, right? And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. It's remarkable. We could spend another 2 hours just getting ourselves to the point where we can begin to see how the life of Christ unfolds. But I can't emphasize enough that if we want to understand the Gospel of John, and correspondingly the Bible itself, and correspondingly the aspirations for us as human beings in God's world, we have to take this worldview. The other Gospels start, and almost immediately after the Gospels start, we keep finding what Jesus does for us. He's committing miracles, he's healing, he's prophesying and teaching. He's telling us what we owe him. He's telling us what he can do for us. But only John's Gospel begins this way, with this absolutely essential myth building. Again, not myth in the sense of made-up stories, but mythic in the sense of epic myth, the idea, the archetypal myth, the one true story out of which all the other stories make sense. You get this beautiful 15-line account in the opening of the Gospel of John. It's cosmological, it's epistemological, it's cosmological. It gives us a sense of universes and how they come to be. It's epistemological. It is an episteme that provides us ultimate knowledge about the ultimate truths of the universe, well beyond our limited, narrow scope of materialism. It is ontological. It is about origins. It is, as the book of Genesis, it is in the beginning, right? It is a genesis. It is a birthing. It is the birth of worlds. It is the moment when the divine, that absolute divine, crosses with the human and the material, the reality of everything. That's the intersection. Think about this for a second before we move on to our next segment next time we're together. This gospel, this first 15 lines of the Gospel of John explain, better than perhaps anything else in Judeo-Christian history, what it would be like when the absolute divine, the timeless, the eternal, the non-material and transcendent crashes into the linear, the physical, the material, the doomed to die. For 33 years, the eternal God walked among us as man. For that 33-year period, the boundaries between our world and his world, between the material world and the eternal world, between life and death, between creation and nihilism, for 33 years, literally, and people misuse the word literally a lot, but in this case, literally, the mythic became the human. The divine became the knowable. The eternal became understandable. And that is a great way to begin what's going to be a rousing gospel. To understand those things will make a lot more sense of what Jesus is doing in this gospel. We'll see you next week.